I don't mean to be the I called it guy, but go back to many of my end of year lists from last year and you'll find me saying that 2023 is looking to be one of the best years for gaming. And with 2023 wrapping up, despite a depressingly bad year for developers, in terms of the games themselves, 2023 has been unbelievable. Simply put, we were spoiled this year, so trust me when I say narrowing my favorite games of the year down to just 10 was no easy task. So much so that I extended it to 15, but still was no easy task. But eventually, I made my list. Usual rules apply, no remasters or re-releases, however, I'll make an exception or some exceptions for certain remakes. Likewise, no DLC, so no Phantom Liberty or God of War Ragnarok Valhalla. Additionally, one game per franchise, and this is also my opinion, and not the definitive best games of the year, but my definitive best games of the year. There are certainly some placings that might ruffle a few feathers. I can think of one already. And lastly, because it's my opinion, that means it's specifically games I played, so certain games you see on screen won't make it because I have not played them. Anyways, I am DPX, and because 10 wasn't enough, this is my top 15 best games of 2023. I'm excited. Are you? Let's get into this. But please subscribe. Just subscribe, okay?
Number 15. Burger King foot lettuce. The last thing you'd want in your Burger King burger is someone's foot fungus, but as it turns out, that might be what you get.
We've been waiting for a new F-Zero game for a long time, and F-Zero 99 isn't quite what we were looking for, but after playing it, the last thing I can do is complain. This might be perhaps my biggest surprise of the year, specifically coming out of nowhere and being just so addicting. F-Zero 99 takes the original F-Zero on the SNES and pits you up against 99 other players. It's not Nintendo's first 99 game with this concept, as they did that with Tetris and Pac-Man, and they did it with Mario, although that was only 35. But F-Zero 99 is definitely the best, as it feels more like you are trying to beat everyone else, like you're actually competing and combating with them, if that makes sense. Even though I am not that good at this game, and most of the footage you see is me doing pretty bad, honestly, it kept pulling me in, and I kept playing more and more. F-Zero 99 might just be one of the most addicting games I've played this year.
And this November, California voters will decide if they wish to spend billions to help fund the work. Here's a look at Proposition 14.
You know, I'm not much of a Potterhead. I've seen like the first 2 movies and might have read one of the books, but never really got too into the wizarding world. However, I gotta give it up for Hogwarts Legacy. I feel like because of the games from this year that came out after this one, Hogwarts Legacy got overshadowed, but this game has a massive open world and one that is vibrant, feels lived in, and is beautiful. It also takes advantage of the wizarding world that, even as someone who's not a Potterhead, I gotta commend it. It lets you pick between 4 houses, and while that doesn't lead to that many major changes in the overall game, it feels all the more faithful. And the combat is very unique too, as you cast spells and shoot magic from your wand to fight enemies, and it's just a lot of fun. Unfortunately, grinding for XP is the opposite of fun, and this game doesn't quite have the staying power I thought it would. Otherwise, Hogwarts Legacy would easily be higher, but don't let that deter you, as this is a fantastic experience. What happens when you take the studio behind The Evil Within and have them make a rhythm action game with combat similar to Devil May Cry and an art style similar to Jet Set Radio? You get a game that sounds like it should be a weird mess, but instead, you get a banger in Hi-Fi Rush. And this is from someone who doesn't even like most rhythm games, but I really enjoyed this one, as Hi-Fi Rush doesn't require you to fight enemies to the beat of the music, but doing so greatly enhances the experience. But either way, the combat and movement feel hella smooth. Plus, the game is screaming with personality and character, with its colorful art style, fire music, and entertaining characters. And plus the animation, like, this looks like a Saturday morning cartoon modernized for the current day. and I mean that in the best way possible. All this makes Hi-Fi Rush a game I never knew I wanted, and if you got Game Pass, you gotta check it out.
You win. Alright, that's cool.
2023 has been a particularly great year for remakes, and even more so survival horror games, and even more so with survival horror remakes. And while the original Dead Space holds up decently well today, this year's Dead Space remake is as terrifying, suspenseful, creepy, and overall amazing as ever. Admittedly, the Dead Space remake doesn't change a whole lot from the original, but what it does change, it changes very well. Obviously, the visuals have been overhauled to look incredible, and all the more terrifying, along with the creatures popping up out of nowhere, making your heart beat insanely fast. On top of that, the new gen features, specifically the rumble on PS5, comes into play and adds to the horror. But even cooler, the more you play, the more new stuff you discover in this game. That sets itself apart quite a bit from the original. But overall, Dead Space Remake might be a little more one-to-one of a remake than what I would normally allow, but they didn't fix what wasn't broken, and because of this remake, Dead Space is back.
Number 11. Your father will die.
You remember when Star Wars Jedi Survivor came out and it was buggy and glitchy? Yeah, that really sucks because it soured a lot of people on this game, as aside from the state it was released in, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a damn good game. And now that it's all patched up, it's easier to see all the highlights of this game, as very few games give you such a feel and idea of what it's like being a Jedi. In other words, cliche, it makes you feel like a Jedi. I got that out of the way. Alright. And that comes from simply just using the lightsaber and the Force, as the combat is smooth and the movement is too. Not to mention the parkour and Souls-like elements are awesome in this game, and the world in terms of its scope just feels huge. Jedi Survivor takes Fallen Order and multiplies it, kind of making it an open world with visuals that, now that the game has been patched, it looks next level amazing. And then the story is also amazing, and possibly being one of the best Star Wars stories, and Cal Kestis is one of the best Star Wars protagonists too. If you are able to, give Star Wars Jedi Survivor another chance. The only reason it's not in the top 10 is because of the state it launched in, but now that that's been fixed, I think it deserves a second chance.
I wanted to give to you, in the last part of your notes here, the significance spiritually of the number 10 in the Bible.
A little bit ago, I said that 2023 was a particularly great year for remakes, but another category that had a great year was fighting games. One reason for that is the release of Mortal Kombat 1. This serves as somewhat of a soft reboot of the series, and I thought that was gonna hinder many aspects of the game, and maybe be an excuse to like not go as big. But man, was I wrong, because the roster, when throwing in both the playable characters and the cameos, makes this possibly the most stacked Mortal Kombat game yet. About the cameos, they add a new dynamic to the gameplay, something that I felt Mortal Kombat kind of needed, and being a soft reboot, Mortal Kombat 1 reinvents many characters. Liu Kang and Raiden have pretty much swapped roles, Scorpion and Sub-Zero are now brothers, Shao Kahn is now General Shao, and he's pretty much like just some guy, I guess. And that's just some of the changes, and I think the game does it in a way that works. Too bad they charge $15 or whatever for fatalities and do a bunch of other bullshit like that. Otherwise, Mortal Kombat 1 would not only be higher on this list, but in the upper echelon of fighting games. Alright guys, let's face it, we ain't getting any sort of Chrono Trigger revival anytime soon. But for those of you who really want more Chrono Trigger, please play Sea of Stars. This takes what you would expect out of a retro-style turn-based JRPG, but does interesting things with it. For one, the turn-based system is unique as the enemies have a timer on them, and you can keep going and taking your turn until the enemy's turn runs out, leading you to possibly strategize a little differently as opposed to just doing your move. The party members of Sea of Stars are also great as they are all very different with their abilities, which also adds a nice dynamic. You got one guy who has abilities from the sun, one girl who has abilities from the moon, some guy who cooks, some ninja chick who uses like poison plasma stuff, and a bunch of other characters who get introduced as late into the game as they do, freshening it up very late in the game, which I thought was awesome. We also get one of the most stunning worlds I have ever seen in a sprite-based game, with possibly the most underrated soundtrack of the year, consisting of too many bangers. Simply put, fan of indies or RPGs, do not pass up on Sea of Stars.
So I'm going to be giving this flavor 8.5 out of 10 scoops.
Hear me out. I get it. Most of you would have Baldur's Gate 3 in your top 3 at least. You know, that might even be pushing it a little bit. The only thing keeping it back for me is that the 7 games higher are games I gravitate towards more. But even that being said, I can't help but be in utter awe at Baldur's Gate 3. The reason this game took over the world by storm the way it did is because it really is a game that never says no. Pretty much anything that comes up in the game, you have multiple options for, what you want to do. There are major characters, all of which you have the option of picking as your main character, who you either recruit into your party, you can kill immediately, or even fuck them. All of these options leads the story to play out however you'd like. You can take the narrative in so many directions, it's actually insane. Baldur's Gate 3 also has stunning visuals that makes it one of the best looking games of the year, along with an amazing soundtrack, a massive open world, and wildly entertaining performances. Once again, the only reason it's not higher is because I'm not a big fan of CRPGs. In fact, this might be the only one that I like. And I'm not really the biggest fan of Dungeons and Dragons in general, but don't let that deter you, as objectively speaking, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game we do not deserve.
36.
Very close, but that's not it. Let's go to Gary the Retard. What number between 2 and 4?
7.
Can you name me a single video game franchise that has 16 numbered entries, aside from Final Fantasy? And I mean like numbered ones, like with the number in the name. I don't think so. And after playing Final Fantasy 16, I can see why, as 16 numbered entries in the series, and the series is still amazing. Final Fantasy 16 is quite the divisive game, and I might have gotten some dislikes and death threats for putting it above Baldur's Gate 3. But it freshens up Final Fantasy in ways that remind me of how, well, God of War 2018 freshened up God of War. And that's no small praise. The combat may be a little simple, but it's fun and entertaining and rewarding. But what it lacks in depth, it makes up for in spectacle. Few games have boss fights quite like Final Fantasy 16. Not to mention, this might just be one of the best stories of any Final Fantasy game, giving it an M rating which helps sets itself apart from the other games, feeling almost like Game of Thrones. I know that's been said a lot when describing this game, but you can't escape it. Also giving us one of the most compelling Final Fantasy protagonists in Clive, with an outstanding performance from Ben Starr, as well as music that is more than worthy of this series, and stunning visuals. Final Fantasy XVI has to be one of the best Final Fantasy games.
Okay, Mrs. Puff, what's my final score?
6.
Woo! I think it's fair to say that Insomniac are possibly like one of, if not the single greatest video game developer in the industry today, as they seem to never miss, and their hot streak continues with none other than Spider-Man 2. Talk about making a definitive sequel to what was already the definitive Spider-Man game. Spider-Man 2 admittedly doesn't do much beyond the standard, but it does said standard exceptionally well. It's the natural progression of Spider-Man 4 and Spider-Man Miles Morales, and combining things from both games and making it so that you play as both Peter and Miles in this game, and the story does a great job following both characters. On top of that, the symbiote gets introduced into this game, and Peter gets the symbiote, which gives Spider-Man 2 a much darker tone. The combat is better than ever, the web slinging is so much fun, the Spider Wings are an amazing addition, Kraven the Hunter is a great villain in this game, and that Venom sequence, my god, if you know, you know. Spider-Man 2 is how to do a sequel, and I am very curious to see how Insomniac managed to outdo themselves yet again.
Oh, chills. Literal chills.
It was number 5. Number 5 killed my brother.
Oh my god, I forgot about that.
I feel like I say this every time I get the chance to, but 2D Mario had really gotten old after the 4 new Super Mario Bros. Games. They were a nice return to form at first, but ironically start to feel old. And even more ironically, Super Mario Bros. Wonder being a different type of 2D Mario and not quite going back to basics, is another return to form. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is the best 2D Mario since Super Mario World, and it sets itself apart with its distinct art style, new environments, and new power-ups. I've heard a lot of people talk about how the elephant fruit was disappointingly underutilized, but I had a lot of fun with that power-up every time I got it, but the bubble flower and drill mushroom were really cool too. But then you get the wonder flower, which turns every level into a goddamn acid trip. When you find out that the devs did not have a deadline for this game, it all makes sense because you notice so much detail all over, whether it be during a normal level, wonder flower sections, the animations of characters and enemies, and so much more. Throw that in with the wide selection of playable characters, and you got a game that marks a new era for Mario with Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Going back earlier when I talked about Dead Space and mentioned that it's a 1-to-1 remake, and normally I don't allow those on lists like this, well, this year was such a good year for remakes that I believe more than one should have made the list, because if there were to only be one remake on this list, without question it would be Resident Evil 4. I've heard people sorta selling this one short more recently. People counted it out from being, say, nominated for Game of the Year before it did eventually get nominated, and when it was, people were saying that it's just a remake, but that is really underselling this game. Resident Evil 4 Remake somehow manages to take one of the greatest games of all time, a game I didn't even think needed a remake, and makes it way better. It's way more of a horror game than the original, with an overhauled atmosphere, and the game also feels like a whole new game. There are also changes to the story and the way certain characters are written, especially Ashley, as she's actually bearable and somewhat likable. Simply put, Resident Evil 4 Remake is easily the best game in the legendary Resident Evil series, and is also easily the best video game remake of all time. Capcom. We just talked about Resident Evil 4 Remake, but Capcom, surely enough, Exoprimal notwithstanding, had an amazing year, as not only did they put out perhaps the greatest video game remake ever made, but they put out a return for the fighting game genre with Street Fighter 6. If y'all know me, this shouldn't be a surprise, but for some of you, seeing Street Fighter 6 placed this high might be a little surprising, but it certainly deserves it, as this is one of the best fighting games I've played in years. When it comes to Street Fighter, SF6 is perhaps the most feature-rich of the whole series, and accessibility options that make it enticing for newcomers and veterans. On top of that, you got a mostly perfect starting roster for returning characters and new characters, and a lot of these newcomers are so much fun. Characters like JP, Jamie, Manon, Kimberly, and more. On top of that, many of the returning characters feel new, and each character has a story that makes each character feel all the more real, oddly enough. But then there is the World Tour mode. It's not perfect, but man is this crazy with a semi-open world single-player campaign with your own custom character. Throw that in with all the detail all over this game and so much more, and you have a game that honestly could have been higher, but Capcom just had to charge $15 for a singular Ninja Turtles costume. Other than that, Street Fighter 6 is a goddamn masterpiece.
What kind of pencil do we take again?
Number 2. Take a number 2.
Looks like you took a big number 2.
You know, going into this year, all my most anticipated games lists would have games like Spider-Man, Resident Evil, Street Fighter, Mario Wonder, Final Fantasy, even Starfield, and also the upcoming number 1, all very high up on those lists. But Alan Wake 2 was never too high. Not that I wasn't excited for it, definitely not why, because the first game was a banger, and I was beyond excited for the long-awaited sequel that felt like after a little while we were never gonna get. But I wasn't quite expecting what kind of game we ended up getting, because holy shit, Alan Wake 2 proves that video games are art. And I know that is pretty high praise, but I think it is deserved, as Alan Wake 2 took me on a ride that I was not expecting to go on, but I wanted it to keep going. For one, while the first game isn't unscary necessarily, Alan Wake 2 is a straight up horror game, with some terrifying creatures and enemies that actually get your heart racing. But that is not all at all. You got the story, which is told in such a way where it left me speechless. You don't just follow Alan Wake, but also you follow an FBI agent named Saga Anderson, and it's not like she's just a side character you play as. No, she's a co-lead. And the way they balance the two characters is done in a way that is very cleverly meta and also helps the story to eventually come full circle at the end. There are some stellar performances and the game gets fucking trippy as well, and it is awesome. But on top of that, on a technical aspect, Alan Wake 2 is mind-blowing. I mean, there's the visuals that might make this the best looking game of the year, but the way this game transitions from gameplay to live action cutscenes is jaw-dropping. And the way you manipulate and change the environment just by holding a button is only possible on this generation. I'm sick of people who haven't played this game calling it the gaming equivalent to Oscar bait, because Alan Wake 2 is an absolute work of art. Even though it's a top 15, this year was such a great year for gaming. I got some honorable mentions. So before we get to number 1, here are the honorable mentions.
And all your stories of crime and chilling thrillers of hard-boiled killers became bestsellers. It was all too much, I had to get away. Show me the champion of light. I'll show you the herald of darkness. Lost in the never-ending night. Diving deep to
I'm Luigi, number 1.
By process of elimination, I'm sure you figured out what my game of the year is, and I'm not going to beat around the bush or even do the fake out that I think would be funny, because it would be pretty funny if I said my game of the year was like, you know, the day before, you know, but nope, it's without question The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. You might say this game is more Breath of the Wild. After all, it has the same map, most of the same music, the same aesthetic, and the same weapon durability mechanic. And it's not worth arguing against that, specifically because you'd be right about that. But Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom does something that very few video game sequels are able to do, let alone a sequel to Breath of the Wild, a game that is always talked about as one of the absolute greatest games ever made. Tears of the Kingdom is not only better than Breath of the Wild, it blows Breath of the Wild out of the goddamn fucking water. Calling Tears of the Kingdom massive, I don't even know if that does it justice. You don't only have the main ground, which is already huge, but you have the sky, which even though it's not as big as the main ground, it's still wow-inducing. But they didn't even stop there, as in addition to the main ground and the sky, we got the depths of Hyrule, looking all the more stunning. But even though that makes the game bigger, it doesn't help the notion of more Breath of the Wild. But what about all these new abilities? You got Ultra Hand, which lets you pick up items in really cool ways and gets you around certain puzzles. Or Recall, where you can rewind items. Or Ascend, which lets you go through certain platforms. Or best of all, Fuse, which lets you get wild, as you might have seen on the internet. Not to mention the shrines are so much fun, the story and quests are so engaging, but best of all, Tears of the Kingdom is a game that lets you play however you want. There is no right way or wrong way to play this game. Anything you come up with could be a proper way to play Tears of the Kingdom, and any order you play it in could work too. It's a game where, despite following a story and objectives, it gives you a sense of freedom and escapism that few games have hit me with as hard as this one has. And most of all, on a personal level, it came out at a time where I really needed a game like this. So without question, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is my game of 2023. Now believe me when I said, this was not easy. Although Tears of the Kingdom might have easily been my number one, the rest of the list was not easy. I'm honestly surprised I was able to get 15 games, because, wow, we had such a great year. So what are your favorite games of the year? If you have 15, let me know 15. If you don't have 15, if you only got 10, if you got 5, if you got 3, if you got 1, let me know. This video has been going on long enough, so I'm just gonna say thanks for watching, and this is probably most likely, almost certainly, my last video of the year. And I just want to say on a personal note, this has been a rough year for me outside of YouTube and video games, and you guys have kept me going. So I just want to say thank you for watching me this year, and here's to a better 2024. Take care, everyone.